I'm Mike Kelly from Project Healing Waters Omaha program, and this is session 2 of the beginner fly tying series. We'll be covering the woolly worm. But first, I'm going to cover a few basic subjects, and I'll start with hackle. Switch cameras here. This is a hackle cape. And this is actually a rooster cape. And if you'll notice at the top of the neck, the bird's head would be right here. At the top of the neck are very short, very fine hackle feathers. And those would be used for flies down in the size 20 range. And as you get further down over the shoulders here, the hackles get longer. The feathers are longer in length, but also the barbules on the feathers are longer. And on a rooster neck, all of these hackles toward the tips, all of the barbules are pretty much web free. You can almost see through the feather, and they're stiff. And so that causes dry flies to be held up off the surface of the water in the surface film. As you get down toward the back here, these feathers are real long. Some of them are a little bit more webby, but they're real long and a little bit wider, not as pointy. Further down the bird, over the back of the bird, is called the saddle. And if you'll notice on a saddle, this is a rooster saddle. The feathers are much longer, longer and thinner. And so on a fly like we're tying tonight, where you need a lot of turns of hackle down the length of the fly, this type of hackle is better suited for the fly we're tying tonight. Then a hen cape. So here's a hen cape compared to a rooster cape. And you'll notice that the feathers on a hen cape are rounded at the tip, and the feathers are real webby. You can see a lot of these feathers you can hardly even see through. And they're very soft. The barbules are real soft as opposed to the stiff rooster hackles. These are used for wet flies and for nymphs because they're subsurface. And this soft hackle will not keep a fly floating on the surface. So that's a little bit on hackle. I'll move the fly into picture here. So this will be the woolly worm that we're tying tonight. The hook I'll be using is a 3X long nymph hook. And the reason that I use 3X long is the body of a woolly worm is a little bit longer than a shorter nymph or the body of a dry fly. And the body is made up of chenille. And I'll cover a little bit on chenille. This is a medium black chenille. And you'll notice that the little fibers on that chenille stand out quite a bit from the core. And this is ultra chenille, and it's very dense, and it has very short fibers. So if you were to wrap this around the hook, it wouldn't cover very much. It wouldn't make the body very very thick, and it wouldn't really show up as well. So for a size 8 like we're doing tonight, you're going to want at least a medium chenille. So I'm going to start with a black thread, and I'm using this is Ultra Thread in 140 denier. It's the same as a 6/0 thread. And so to start, let me zoom in a little bit more. To start the thread, I'm going to start about an eye length back. And I'm going to take a couple wraps and then go back over it to trap that in. Take about 6 to 8 wraps. And then I'm going to cut off the leftover, the tag. Now the tail of this fly is red wool or red yarn. Like this is a synthetic yarn. It normally comes in 3 or 4 plies, and I've peeled one of these away. So this is I'm going to use two of the plies, and I'm going to go ahead and start that right up here toward the front of the hook, and wrap back toward the end of the shank. This fly doesn't need touching turns because the body will be covered up, but a lot of times I like to use touching turns just to keep me in good practice of doing it, because a lot of flies do require that. So I'm going to go back to the end of the shank, and normally that's right above the barb of the hook. And if you notice, as your thread hangs down, there's the barb. The straight part of the hook here, from the back of the eye to where the bend starts, is the shank. And so I'm going to go right to the end of the shank, and then I'm going to cut this tail at about the back of the bend right there. So that gives me the little red tail of this fly. Now I'm going to tie in the chenille next. And for the chenille, if you pull away the fuzz at the end there, you expose the core. You see those two threads hanging out right there. That's a twisted core that those fibers are all wrapped in. So I'm going to use that to, let me do that again. My thread was wanting to reach back. So I'm going to use those threads to tie my chenille down. And then I'm going to wrap forward. The next thing I'm going to tie down is wire, and it doesn't have to be gold. It can be copper, silver. It doesn't show that much, but it's a rib to help hold down the hackle, and you'll see when we get to that point. If you use your tying scissors to cut wire, you'll dull them really quickly. So this is a ultra wire in small, and if you just hold it against the spool, you can break it pretty easily. It's brittle enough to where you can break it. So I'm going to tie in this wire, and I'm going to let thread torque take that around toward the back of the hook. So now my rib is on the back of the hook there. Then I have my chenille and my wire tied in. So now I'm going to move my thread back toward the front of the hook, and you'll see I'm just doing spaced turns now just to get it up there quickly. And I'm going to come back to the point where I started, about an eye length back from the eye. Now I'm going to take this chenille and wrap forward. You can leave a little bit of space in between each wrap. It doesn't have to be densely packed on there. But you want to move that forward, and you don't want to crowd the eye too much. So right here, as I'm wrapping back up, I'm getting to the point where my thread's hanging. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Bring my thread over. And then tightly wrap around that a couple more times. Make sure it's secure. Then I'm going to lift that up with the point of my scissors. I'm going to go in there and just cut that chenille. Now I'm going to take a couple more wraps just to make sure that's all nice and secure. I have my wires hanging out of the back there. Now I'm going to take that that hackle that I was showing you earlier, and down here toward the base of the feather, there's always a real soft fuzzy stuff, and the stem is really thick. You don't want to use that. For one thing, this thick stem there is pretty brittle, and that will cause a lot of problems with bulk, and sometimes it can crack. As you get down further up the feather, you can see that the stem gets much thinner, and the hackles are a lot more uniform in length. So I'm going to come down right in here where it's not the fuzzy stuff anymore, and the stem is pretty thin. Now I'm just going to strip some of those back like that, and then take my scissors and cut that stem. Now with nice tight turns, I'm going to tie that stem in. Taking quite a few turns because I want to make sure that's locked in good. And then I'm going to take a hackle pliers, and I'm going to grab the tip of that hackle. And I'm going to take 2 good turns at the front here. 1, 2, and then I'm going to start working back. And you want spaced wraps, and that's called palmering. Go all the way down the body to the end where the wire is waiting. And then I'm going to reach around and grab that wire. And I'm going to wrap forward over the hackle. Now that I have that first turn holding the hackle down, I can let go of the hackle pliers. And then just take that wire and wiggle it back and forth so you avoid tying down those hackles. You might get a couple of them wrapped underneath. That's not a problem. Just wiggle it back and forth as you wrap up the shank. till you get to the front, where your thread's waiting. And then take a wrap over that wire. I'm going to fold these hackles back a little bit. Take some real good tight turns over that wire. I keep getting it in my way there. Now you notice my thread started to kind of pull apart. See how it's kind of flattened? You just take your bobbin and spin it clockwise as if you were looking down over it. If you're looking down from the top, it would be clockwise. Just strip those hackles back so they're not in the way. And that cords up the thread, and you can just make some nice tight wraps. Now that that's all secure, if you take that wire and just work it back and forth, holding your thread tight, it'll break off. Now, I'm going to take my whip finish tool, or you can use a half hitch tool, and starting at the back, take about 4 or 5 wraps forward. Pull it nice and tight. And then snip the tying thread. And then you can come back to the back here, clip off that excess hackle stem. And that's the woolly worm. Now the palmering that we did down the body here is a term when the hackle is wrapped down the length of the hook shank. Flies have been tied in this fashion since the 1600s in Europe. The modern version of the woolly worm originated in the Ozarks as a bass fly, but it really became popular when Don Martinez from West Yellowstone, Montana, commercialized the pattern in the 1950s. It's a nondescript attractor fly that can be used to represent terrestrials or a large nymph. You can kind of see where maybe it would imitate a fuzzy caterpillar, but it's not really meant to be fished on the surface. It will sink a little bit, and it can be looks sort of like a stonefly nymph or a dragonfly nymph. But again, with that red tail and the contrast against the black chenille, it's just a good attractor pattern.